Okay, so this is a proposal for adding into PHP. There's been quite a few attempts at addressing a problem known as injection. So we've got SQL injection, HTML injection, command line injection. And the point of this particular function is to distinguish between safe strings and in your variables, which have been defined within the PHP script, and anything that's unsafe, which has been tainted by external sources. And we'll cover that in a bit. I want to address this because it's been a constant problem with programming for a long time. The OWASP top 10 continues to list injection as like the main problem. And if you just look at the CVEs, and there are thousands of them per year, just take a look at the last couple of versions of WordPress, and cross-site scripting is still common, and SQL injection still rules the day. I should also point out that we'll cover taint checking a bit, but Literal is not exactly the same as taint checking, but takes some of the similar ideas. And Dave, I think you like static analysis. Static analysis is also useful, but it's rarely solved. Injection problems are rarely solved by it. Obviously, still do it. Still use static analysis, but it is hard to follow from every source to sync. And again, we'll cover this in a bit. And also, we can't expect every programmer to use static analysis for everything. So here's just a quick example of static analysis. This is PHP Stan, and it thinks this query is fine. It can be configured to start looking for these problems, but even at the highest level of checking, it thinks that's okay. And some similar. Okay, in this case, I had to tell it was definitely a string, but again, it considered this to be fine by default. Now, SARM does have an interesting feature called taint analysis, which again sort of flows into this similar sort of idea, but in this case, it hasn't actually identified this particular problem. It's down to a bug, and this is the common thing with taint checking. There are problems with it. Now, I've had some confidence by this because I've been looking at this problem for a very long time, and I've looked at many different solutions. And Christoph Kern, who works at Google back in 2015, surprisingly came to the same conclusion I have. I'm a little bit later to the game, but he was, and the rest of the Google engineers, identified that developer education doesn't solve this problem. We've tried it lots, doesn't work. And these bugs are very hard to find after the fact. So you've got manual tested, automated testing, static analysis, human code reviews. So it will find some of these bugs, but you can't find all of them. So Google went ahead and started looking at this, implementing this solution themselves. They started off doing like a HTML injection protection, and they've also done SQL injection protection, again with this particular approach. And it's been very successful for them. We've also started to see talk about this being introduced into JavaScript. So they can, the idea is that the template object will be able to distinguish strings from a trusted developer versus strings which may be attacker controlled. So let's have a look at a basic example of where I see problems coming in. So let's say we've got a list of members. At the moment, it's limited to type 1. We're going to update this so that you can start looking at different types. And the idea is that you'll be able to sort of say, look, and here's type 2. So how might that work? Now, this is using Doctrine as an ORM. And let's say this is how it's being set up straight away. Nice, simple query, all perfectly safe. If you're to add on a parameter, this is how you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to keep the parameters separate from the commands. But it's not unrealistic to expect a developer to accidentally type this. Someone who's not experienced in programming. And this is the thing which is quite concerning, because from their point of view, it worked. It took in the value and it did actually work. But if you were to be a bit malicious and you typed in u.type_id, you've just proven that there's an SQL injection vulnerability there, and you could continue that to exploit the website further. So In this case, what we're looking at is there's a string here and it is a literal. And now by editing it, we've introduced an unsafe string. We've added something from an external source, in this type, the get parameter type ID. And that example I showed you in the screenshot, that's the string it ended up creating. It was aware where utype ID equals utype ID, which is always true. This type of attack happens everywhere. So Doctrine also has the create query, propel ORM as a different ORM. In its where clause, you could potentially put something in wrong there. Our find method and twig, you know, we've just talked about SQL, but it happens in HTML templates as well. So this is twig being used correctly, or one of the ways it can be used correctly, but it could be done like this, which is wrong. And if you were to have this, you can do some HTML injection with a perfectly good templating engine. It just didn't know not to trust it. We also see this with shell commands. So, you know, potentially bring something in from an unsafe location. That's also bad. Now, historically, we've talked, you know, we've got taint checking. There's an extension available for PHP at the moment. This was like a first attempt at trying to solve this. Well, probably second after magic quotes, but we won't go there. The idea is that you have a variable. If it's defined in the script, it's untainted. And if you combine untainted things together, it's combined to create something that's considered safe. If you were to take something from an external source, it is considered tainted. And if you combine that together, then that is considered not safe. If you do HTML entities, this is a method to untaint it. That's to sort of say, this has been escaped, therefore it is safe. And it should be safe-ish. If we take this example though, we've got two tainted variables. We untaint them. Now, according to that very simple logic, that should be safe. But if you were to pass in a JavaScript string, that would be encoded, and you've got yourself a cross-site scripting vulnerability. So if that was to happen, the victim could just click on the link and they're running JavaScript on your website. Here's another example of using the taint thing. So that tainted variable has been escaped along with the untainted string. Now that in theory is also safe, but you notice I'm missing some quotes around this. So if I was to pass in the ID of a string, you'll end up with a where ID equals ID. And we see this with HTML as well, with a tainted thing being combined in, untainted. Again, you're thinking, surely this is safe because it's been escaped. Well, we're missing some quotes. So if the person was to pass in this bit of, well, HTML, in fact, you also have some JavaScript on here. So it will try and load the image, it will fail, and then it will run the evil JavaScript. Also, taint checking doesn't really consider things like character encoding issues. So when you are escaping things, that can be a problem. And the PDO quote function in particular is a nice example of that, because it clearly says it's only theoretically safe. So escaping strings, especially for SQL, is only ever theoretically safe. And we should really be focusing on using parameterized queries where the query, the SQL, goes to the database first, it works it out, and then the user supplied parameters come in second, can't touch the first part. So in summary, we do not mix safe strings, literals, with anything that may be attacker controlled. And we need a way to ensure this never happens. So this is the proposal. You have a function called isLiteral, and you pass in a string or a variable. This case, it returns true because it is a literal. It's defined within the PHP script. Again, if you're using a variable to store it, that's also true because that was also defined within the PHP script. And even if you combine them together, that's perfectly fine. But if you introduce something from an external source, no, not having it. It's not going to be allowed. Even if you try encoding it to whatever you need it to be, it's also not allowed. And even if you were to take a string which was defined in a PHP script, a literal, if you were to apply a function to it, it should lose that ability to do things because those transformations could cause problems. So again, we're not having any of that. So back to that example of the query builder, this could be done in the doctrine. Doctrine could imply, use this function itself to sort of say, look, this is a literal, it is safe, fine, carry on. If it's not a literal, it's been tainted, it's been damaged, then we'll throw an exception. Twig could do a similar thing. If that template is a literal, it's fine. If it's not a literal, because it's been tainted or damaged, then it will throw an exception, or could throw an exception. Obviously, exceptions onto an existing project might be a bit difficult, so we might look at this as a different approach, simply checking, is literal function available? Because whichever version of PHP this will hopefully come into, older versions will need to be supported. And you might instead choose to raise notices at first, just to start getting people aware of the problems, and then you can ramp it up and go to higher levels. There's a different way of doing it. For older versions of PHP, you could define a function which just always returns true, but later versions of PHP which actually provide this information would be able to do that. So one of the problems which is often talked about with tainting and this kind of separation is what happens when you need to use something that can't be kept separate. And the example here is you can't put your table names and your field names in the parameters, they have to be part of the SQL. So this is a classic example, but there are ways of making it work. In this case, I have an array of fields in which you are allowed to sort by, and the query string that comes in will allow you to choose from that list, and if not, it will fall back to, well, if it's not defined, it'll be created. If it's an invalid one, it will go to 0 or false 0 name in this case. And you have now created an SQL string which is based on literals within the PHP script. And here's another example of what often is requested, is a where in query where you have a variable number of parameters, as in from an end source. Yes, I know some people like to use like int_val on an array and implode it in. Not a good idea, again, because you're still mixing in user supplied values. So here's a different way of doing it. Count up the number of elements, fill out an array with question marks, implode it with a comma, and then put it as your SQL. That's effectively what happens. And then the values go in as parameters as normal, and it keeps it nice and separate and safe. And that's basically it. The idea I've got is to try and explain this to as many people as possible, to try and get developer interest, to find out if I've missed anything, because there's been a few attempts at this before. So Google are showing that they are going in that direction. Well, they already have gone in that direction, and JavaScript is likely to get it soon. But I need to be able to justify it to the PHP core developers. And I would also like to get a load of libraries involved to sort of say, yes, this is something we would actually like to use. So I'm hoping that this allows us to sort of explore the idea and do that. So if you've got any questions, then that's it. Okay.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Craig. That's really interesting. I know I haven't looked into the SARM taint analysis that they've done, but just from what you were showing there, even if you're just limited to method or function parameters, and you could just say, I expect this method or function parameter to be untainted, and you could somehow communicate that to a static analysis tool, that is potentially possible as a way of doing it before you get runtime checks.
Yeah, the taint checks are tricky to get right, because taint checks, they often have an ability to say it's untainted. It does actually need to be, no, this was actually defined in the PHP script. And the problem you have with static analysis is it has to try and keep everything, well, it's just keeping track of everything, and it's kind of close to impossible to do that. And that's why I generally think you can't really do it without it being a runtime thing, because there's variables coming in everywhere. Now, PHP already has a little flag in it, sort of. It's called interned. So it does kind of imply that it knows it, but for us to actually use it, there would be some development work involved in that. The intern thing is just about garbage collection, basically saying, can I garbage collect it? And well, something that's defined in the PHP script can't be garbage collected. But yeah, it is theoretically possible for a static analysis to do it, but it would be error prone. And I don't want error prone things. I want something that's, you know, definitively, this is safe. And I think that's where we need it to be in the PHP language. And I need to get better at explaining it and trying to push for it. And I'm hoping that Google's answers and things, you know, their approach, the JavaScript one, and there's other people looking at it as well, just saying, look, we've had enough of escaping. It just doesn't work. You know, you need to use parameters for SQL. You need to use templating systems for HTML. You need to find ways of running commands without concatenating strings. And yeah, so does that sort of answer it?
I think it does. Yeah. I might follow up with further questions, but might ask some other stage. So we've got one from Dan. For things like Drupal, where it's all data driven, you'll have queries like select star from foo where bar in soup fox pick. Actually, can you see the Q&A questions?
Yes. So
when it comes to the database, is it an easy way of tag this will be allowed? Is it an easy workaround?
Actually, if I go back to that slide, he says, where's the slide? Share screen, desktop 1, and that's Zoom's going in front of it. So can you see that? That was exactly the example that we're talking about. It's where ID in. Now, I wouldn't allow what you're describing there. I would have it as select star from foo where bar in question mark comma question mark question mark. Send that to the database, let it work on it, and then come up with the 3 parameters afterwards. Because if you start mixing strings in, it's not great. You know, it's only theoretically safe when you escape strings and put them into the actual command. So this works, and yeah, that's the way I would do it, and that's the way I do it. Well, admittedly, I don't write a PHP code out like this anymore, but I've got an abstraction for it. But that's effectively what happens in my code base, and it works really well.
Okay, yeah. If you've got any follow on from that, Dan, just pop it in a chat or questions. Another question from Liam. How will this functionality help the problem where devs aren't educated? If they still use MySQLite arrow query functions directly without a wrapper function like doctrines that's using the is literal function for protection, they still be exposed, right? Or is this proposed also allow you to check internally in MySQL and PDO?
Yeah, so I need to do it in multiple phases. Basically, this is first phase, just allowing the libraries to be able to do this because they're in the best position to implement it straight away. The second phase is to basically say to the PHP core developers, once we've proven it's worked, and that should be possible, we can start saying to them, well, the core functions should also be starting to raise notices, warnings, whatever, for things which are not safe. But that becomes a lot easier once the core functionality is in place and people are using it and it's proving to actually help things. Because obviously libraries will get people talking in the right way, they'll start thinking about it in the right way. You know, keeping those two things very separate, you know, your commands as literal strings that define in PHP, and all the user supplied dangerous stuff is kept different. And yes, you're right, the MySQL extension and the PDO and everything else could in the future quite easily just check that as they are running. They just basically run the same check. But before we get into that kind of level of integration, we need the basic building blocks first and to prove the theory works. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for that answer. If anyone's got any follow-ups on those, just put them in the chat window. Yeah, I mean, what kind of reception are you getting from the PHP world in terms of people wanting to take it on?
It's the annoying thing is everyone's sort of going, yeah, that's great, that would work. And then they try to find ways in which it doesn't work. So I've had a lot of time to think about the problems. And this is where we have the wherein clause, and we also have the field name example, because obviously they can't be parameters. They need to be known in the first part. And that's why we've got this sort of setup. The main concern really is about performance from the PHP core developers' time, because obviously this is an extra bit of information on it, and potentially having to sort of work with it. Now, half of that's already in place by the interned flag, but I must admit I'm not a C programmer myself, so I can't tell you for definite that that's all we need to worry about. It's just an interesting part to it. So my main thing I'm worried about is the performance side of things. Obviously, it pales into comparison to the performance impact of the types. You know, we have type systems now. That is a lot more work than this. And, you know, I think that's worth it. But I have to be able to justify it. And I do think by this very extreme version of, you know, keep them separate, it will justify it, because you can't have injection problems when there's nothing being injected. And that's probably the simplest part of it, I think. So yeah, and I think actually that's Jonathan, I've just seen the Q&A. And yes, you're right, there is a flag on each variable to keep track of where it came from, which it kind of already does have, because of the interned flag. There's also Zhejian Wei, who's the person who actually created the PHP Taint extension. They've talked about how the PHP strings variables also have flags on them already. The slight issue, I think, is it's already got 8 flags on it, which is unfortunately just the wrong number for us to complete the byte. But potentially that's another area it could be added to if it's you know, if needs be. But again, it's trying to get enough developers interested in the idea and saying, oh, actually, yes, this will actually solve these problems. You know, rather than us sort of going, oh, we'll carry on using static analysis, or we'll carry on using developer training, which I think it's safe to say hasn't worked in the last, I've been doing it 20 years. So, and I was aware of it when I first started, and it doesn't look like the numbers are going down. So we have to do something differently, and I think this is the best way for it.
Yeah. Well, that's yeah. No, I mean, just imagine when it comes in there, and the trouble all the people have with their existing code.
This is the thing, though, is you build it up. So you start off with something, you might just sort of say, okay, these are the most sensitive areas. Because I'm giving you a function, you can put that where you want. And you just start off with minor ones. Think of like how you do with your taint checking and the different levels you can have. You could just sort of say, look, I'm going to start off with level 1, which is nothing, but you build up to notices, warnings, exceptions. Depending on what it is, you might just start with the SQL side of things, because that's the most dangerous, but move on to things, the HTML side. Maybe the template engine starts off first because they got started with it. You know, there's because it's this very simple low-level building block. You can build it in at any point and just start with that, and go. It's not like you switch it on and go, oh my god, there's thousands of errors coming in. You know, it's how you want to develop it, and all I want to do is provide you with that very low-level, simple flag, just to sort of say, yeah, this is safe, this is good. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much.